Loving you, it keep me satisfied. And I can't explain, oh no, the way that I'm feeling inside. You look at me, we kiss and then I close my eyes and baby, whoa, here it comes again. I can hear music. I can hear music. Hello, everyone. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And I have a confession to make right off the top because I kinda slept on The Long Walk this weekend. This was a movie I was seriously looking forward to. Publicity campaign for it was virtually perfect, but when it came down to it, scoping out some of the other releases that were coming out through that weekend, I figured I'd be better off cramming in another double feature, this one a music-themed one, where I decided I was instead going to check out The History of Sound, a really interesting-looking period romantic drama starring Paul Mescal and Josh O'Connor as a pair of music archivists and secret lovers who travel the East Coast cataloging and recording folk music in the early 20th century. Only to chase that with Spinal Tap 2, The End Continues, but it turns out that I up because while I thought I was going to be able to catch an early evening screening of The History of Sound, it turns out that I hadn't been paying attention and actually purchased a ticket for next Thursday because guess what? The History of Sound isn't being given the dignity of a limited Thursday night preview, so yay, I'm thinking I completely spoiled my plans. Any other showings of The Long Walk were going to conflict with my late screening of Spinal Tap 2. So at the last minute, I decided to grab what seemed like the only screening of Rabbit Trap that day, this being a small international co-production set in 1973 and starring Dev Patel and Rosie McEwen as a married pair of avant-garde musicians and sound artists who vacation to a secluded cabin in rural Wales only to run afoul of some old-fashioned fairy trickery. And I figured, oh, stupendous, a film about musicians, all about the seductive nature of sounds, maybe my music-themed movie double feature wasn't so spoiled after all. But there I was neglecting to anticipate that besides picking a showing of The History of Sound literally a week out, I had already determined to see the new Legacy Spinal Tap sequel, and good lord, that was just god-awful. Not that there weren't some funny moments for the amount of time that I actually kept watching it. I did walk out of this one, folks, and while I would usually not rate a movie I didn't stick with all the way through, I'm fairly confident that nobody is going to disagree with me that Spinal Tap 2 is exactly the sort of movie that you are safe to walk out on, in that it's not even really a movie, it's barely a Channel 4 special, in that for long stretches of it, it really does seem to forget that it's supposed to be a comedy, and when it does remember that it's supposed to be funny, it's just like the most hackneyed stuff like, oh, this old musician makes a pass at a younger woman drummer and surprise, surprise, she's a lesbian. Oh yeah, that's situational comedy gold right there. Or it'll just be an excuse to cram in even more interminable celebrity cameos in which you can tell Rob Reiner is desperately trying to cut around how unfunny these guys are at doing either improv or scripted comedy. And he's like, I forgot to put the comedy in my comedy movie. Now I just have a long stretch of scenes without any jokes or gags, and instead of being a parody of rock bands, it just comes off like this really is a lame phoned-in legacy profile of a boring rock band. Just such a bitterly appropriate title for this movie, equivalent of life support, The End Continues. Yeah, more like the end goes on and on and on. So this episode is going to be all about Rabbit Trap, this being a feature debut for writer-director Bryn Cheney, and while this small production seems all but doomed to be marginalized to the ghetto of some specific subgenre genre, be it psychological horror or folk horror. I think it's better to view Rabbit Trap less as a horror flick of any kind and more as a darkly romantic fantasy. A ghost story, more in keeping with the very deep history of folklore that informed so much of the popular history of UK and English fantasy literature long before the term horror had even been normalized. Not that traditions of horror don't leave their own traces in Chaney's vision at all, but if you must call Rabbit Trap a horror movie, it's probably better to keep it in mind in the overlapping terrain of similar films and filmmakers who strike less for shocks or a creeping sense of terror and more for an unnerving mixture of quaint sympathy and sentimentalism and awe in the face of the fantastical and weird and unknown. Thinking less The Wicker Man in the case of folk horror or Nicholas Roeg's Don't Look Now for the psychological stuff, and more the earlier works of Guillermo del Toro, especially Kronos and The Devil's Backbone. This is not a story about either monsters or monstrosity. Rabbit Trap is rather a twisted fairy tale in which Mattel and McEwen, as hipster married couple Darcy and Daphne, while the former is out on his long morning routine of collecting natural sounds from the flora, fauna, and atmosphere of Wales, picks up on a mysterious noise deep in the high-landed woods that sounds uncannily like a woman screaming. Darcy follows the noise, which only grows more cacophonous and hypnotic the closer he gets, and discovers the source of it in a ring of mushrooms that, for centuries, similar natural structures have been dubbed fairy rings or elf rings or pixie rings in folk cultures, stretching across the breadth of the modern UK and Ireland, places where it's alleged that fairies and elf folk keep their villages and perform their rituals. When Darcy steps into the ring, he passes out only to wake up realizing his reel-to-reel recorder has been on the whole time, and though deeply shaken by his experience when he returns to the cottage, his wife Daphne immediately begins interpolating the sounds into her compositions and experimenting with making them into a demo track. This in turn attracts the attention of a mysterious, unattended adolescent child who goes unnamed but is played by Jade Crute, who immediately takes an obsessive shine to the pair of cosmopolitan interlopers and especially to Daphne herself. And I shan't give too much away as far as which particular folk myth Chaney actually manages to make a very interesting twist upon, but I will go as far as to say that it's such a simple but interesting inversion of the classical framework of this kind of fairy story that I'm not sure why more filmmakers hadn't tried it before, and to wit, I think it's honestly so important that people don't go into this feeling like it's supposed to be metaphorical and another lame trauma dump pseudo-logical horror flick about core wounds and it's about Patel and McEwen's characters losing touch with reality or whatever. Though maybe a little too cryptically structured and magical realist for its own good, Rabbit Trap is not a movie about psychology. The characters have psychological traumas, and sometimes those traumas intersect with the fantastical and horror-adjacent elements of the story. But what I honestly found so refreshing about Chaney's writing of these characters, and especially Patel's heavy lifting in his performance of this deeply wounded man who has found all his escape and solace in sounds, only for the very love to betray him in the form of this sojourn into dread, the trauma of the characters is really only there to root them and define them as characters, to give dimensions to what does turn out to be a rather cryptic story where a lot of fantastical things happen, but there aren't a lot of explicit or clear answers to what is going on, and indeed, as we approach the rather surprising climax of Rabbit Trap, in which Chaney makes a rather daring breakaway from both the style and tone that dominated so much of the film and is no doubt going to alienate a lot of people, either looking for more explicit answers to the mystery of the film or a more conventional horror film climax. Though cryptic and magical realists, the fantastical elements of Rabbit Trap aren't just a redundant, flimsy metaphorical layer there to make the emotional trauma informing the characters seem more significant than they actually are. This is about as straightforward of a supernatural tale as you can get, albeit one that just happens to focus on two characters who are themselves just weird enough in their own right, in their own time, in their own cultural period, and their own particular psychological quirks to push through it and maybe learn some healthy lessons about themselves along the way. For as many more baseline psychological horror films that have dominated the more boutique, middle-brow, art house genre crossover range of these sorts of movies in the last 2 decades, it really is rather nice to see a first-timer like Chaney flexing not only such a talent for balancing effective character study with more high-concept fantastical genre stuff, unlike what a lot of his contemporaries and antecedents seem to do, which is to just mush these things together and expect them to gel, as opposed to the flimsiness of the metaphorical horror seem to both detract from the seriousness of the psychological study of the characters, as well as from the apparent seriousness of the filmmaker in whatever the fantastical or weird or horrific overlay is. Like, say if you were going to make a movie about a witch, but it just comes off as it doesn't really matter if it's a witch, and you yourself don't even really care that much about witches, except again, as a really belabored metaphor. But what Chaney also has going for him is such a determined and calculated sense of how he can take the generic and formulaic expectations we have of horror films in order to make a movie that is equally interested in the psychology of its characters as it is in the classic folkloric elements underpinning its story, and take both in an emotional direction where, quite frankly, you're rather bowled over by the fact that, like, oh wow, I'm finally watching one of these sorts of movies that doesn't feel deeply pessimistic and cynical. This is a twisted fairy tale, but with a not so much a happy, but an optimistic ending and an optimistic creative philosophy working behind it. And as far as being a movie that has to now do all the compensation for my aborted music movie night, I will say that Lucretia Dalt's original music is quite striking, and I did kind of enjoy toying with the idea of who exactly this Darcy and Daphne were supposed to be in the context of music in the 70s. There's this great line exchange where the kid that Jade Crute plays asks Darcy whether Daphne is famous, and he replies, "She's less famous than she is influential," which works because even in the psychedelic and progressive and early electronic context of the early 70s, it does become rather hard to imagine that Daphne's place in it would be, or how much money these two would be making. So it works that the music she makes, and especially what she does with the kind of living animus force that Darcy accidentally discovers, seems to actually be prophesying the sort of ambient and new agey stuff that was still quite some years away from gaining any kind of success in even niche music circles. Honestly, I couldn't stop pleasantly imagining that in reality, Darcy and Daphne are just two proteges of like the BBC radiophonic workshop who found each other. Other than that, Rabbit Trap isn't a spectacular debut by any means, but it is original, it is well balanced in terms of its more straightforward story and character elements, while still making space for experimentation that never becomes a surface level focus of things. It's well shot, well acted, well scored, and again, a really daring tonal shift in the ending that I found quite satisfying. I'm giving Rabbit Trap a 3.5 out of 5. With that, I'm tapping out. Thank you so much for sticking through this whole video, and please don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the New Movie Diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.